honestly don't understand the obsession with China, nor do I understand the obsession with Russia. Both of them to me just seem profoundly irrational and potentially catastrophic. From what I understand is that every time that the Pentagon is war gamed, a war like over Taiwan, we lose. And it's not surprising. I mean, it's similar again to Russia and Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine is a much larger country, but then Taiwan is an island. It makes it more difficult to attack, but also easier to blockade. There's different ways of looking at it. But it's an existential question for China, and it's in their own, very much not in their own backyard, but let's say, I don't know, it's right, obviously, very much within their sphere. There's no question about it. And they have all the advantages. They can have, they can fire missiles from their vast territory at the U.S. Navy, and the U.S. Navy is, has this long line, of logistics. They do have bases in the area, but it's just not. It cannot compare with what China has. They just clearly have dominance there. It's their sphere, and they have been preparing for this for decades. I remember actually translating like military analyses about attacks on how a war might play out from 20, 30 years ago, at the start of my translation career. Obviously this is something that the Chinese have been studying intensively and preparing for, and they have and they have all the advantages, both in terms of motivation and in terms of assets. And that's what the war games show, that we're going to lose. So why are we doing this? Is it just going to be, well, you have to say Hegseth and all these people. They don't say they actually want war with China, but they want to, they say that we have to counter them. But if you're not really capable of winning a war with them, then what are you actually doing? It's, in other words, you say we got to kind of bluff them, or we got to increase the cost. But if you're going to increase the cost for them, what are the costs going to be for the U.S. Navy? It's going to be a huge humiliation, I believe. I don't know what they're doing. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you say they war game it and we lose. Of course we lose. When have we won? Really, when has the U.S. military can say that they had a success, a true victory since World War II?
Yeah. Of course, these have been generally wars with against, let's say, relatively primitive or weak opponents. They have been battles against insurgents. It's a different kind of warfare. And I guess, in every case, though, it's just like we're fighting on somebody else's territory. Whether we're talking about the Viet Cong or we're talking about the Taliban. Okay, this is their territory. And maybe they're a lot weaker with you than you are on paper. But, they want to see you gone. You say, no matter what, this is my land. You came here and invaded it. I'm going to fight, and, I'm willing to sacrifice my life for this. And that's just not true of the American soldiers in this. I don't want to sacrifice my life for, some changing, geopolitical objective. There's always mission creep. We start off, we're doing this for this, and then the mission is redefined. It's clear that it isn't an existential. If it is existential, then everybody knows what it's about. But American soldiers in these places, they don't know what it's about. It's just not clear. It's not clear that leaders really know what it's about. And so they don't want to sacrifice their lives. So even when on paper, it looks like it's, we have the advantage, we tend to lose. And in this case, on paper, the Chinese have the advantage, but they also have the motivation.
Right. So, we always lose, right? The U.S. military, is that fair to say, or am I being hyperbolic?
Yeah, I have to say, well, you go to the Korean War, you could say that we prevented a complete takeover of the Korean Peninsula by the communists there. So we have what we have now, is the peninsula is divided between North and South, between the communists and the South Koreans.
Yeah. Well, any war before you were born doesn't count.
Yeah, right.
You know?
Yeah, you have to say that the Vietnam War was a failure. We killed a lot of Vietnamese, 2 million, but we lost something like 55,000 of our own men. And in the end, we withdrew, and and Vietnam fell to the communists. So it was a failure. We lost that war. You have to say that's true in Afghanistan. We killed a lot of Afghans, but yeah, in the end, we had to leave. And the Taliban is in charge again. Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, because these are just, they're, I think in the end, because they're wars of choice. It's like when we feel like this is something, this is not a war of choice, like in the case of the Second World War, you do have to say, well, anyway, okay, we were attacked in Pearl Harbor, and that did enrage a lot of Americans. And so many people, rushed out to sign up, said like, we have to take revenge. The Japs have attacked, and, we got to teach them a lesson. And then, because the Japanese and the Germans were close allies, that extended to Germany as well. So it was a different kind of situation. And at least like in the case of, Germany and Japan, you could make the argument, I don't think it's thoroughly convincing, but you could make you could back then, and you could still make the argument, that they did present a real threat, even to U.S. power, simply because they were very powerful countries, and they were in the process of, taking over large swaths of territory. And, so somewhere down the road, they could really present an existential threat to the U.S. Again, you could argue that, but you just can't argue that with the Taliban or the Viet Cong or, any of these other smaller insurgent forces that we've taken on.
Right. So if we've lost every war since at least the Korean War, then where does this... that wasn't, you couldn't really call that a successful war, but it wasn't a total failure either, right? Right. So if we've lost every single war, basically since World War II, Korean War, then where does this just ironclad belief that the U.S. military is an unstoppable force, that we are just all powerful, all dominant, when we don't really have much to back it up, because we don't see countries like China or Russia engaging in wars of choice. We don't see their military potential on display the way that the Americans have, but there's just this self-assuredness within Americans that we are top dog, no questions asked. That's one of those holy grails. You don't touch that. Everybody knows America's number one. But first of all, I've asked this you before, but I'll ask you again. I mean, do you believe that's true? And then where does this belief come from if it's not true?
Yeah, well, I think it does come out of World War II. There was, you could say in a way, there were two sort of, not exactly unipolar moments, but we'll just call it that for the time being. At the end of World War II, there was really one great power that was left standing. That came out of the war stronger than ever. The other powers, even though victorious ones, the Soviet Union really, again, was the victor in Europe, more so than the U.S. But they suffered horribly. There was 28 million dead, and so much of their industry had just been obliterated. There was so much of the Western Soviet Union was just smoking ruins. And that was true of Japan. Of course, had been flattened by these bombing raids and the nuclear bombs. And it was true of China was already quite weak, but it was, at the end of World War II, it was even weaker. And then in the midst of a civil war. So there was we stood alone at that point. And so we really did, dominate the world in so many ways. Now, of course, the Soviet Union reconstituted itself and became a military rival anyway, and so we did have the Cold War, a superpower rivalry, but there was still that sense that came out of at the end of World War II that we were the preeminent power, and we really were. I mean, if you look at a lot of measures, economic and military, certainly the combination of of both of those. And then we had the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that was the one rival. Then we had a true unipolar moment, right, where there was no rival. So there was already this tendency towards exceptionalism, but then that became reinforced during the 1990s. And, like Marco Rubio's comments notwithstanding, I think it's still very much part of the American psyche. Both of the common people, but also of the political class. We are the, we are the exceptional nation. That's what Madeleine Albright said. We see farther than others, and whatever, there's a sense that we're almost sort of been anointed to rule the world. And I think, it's kind of, especially if you look at the past 20, 25 years, the consequences of that kind of thinking, you'd have to say really has been disastrous, but it's still there. It's still there. You still, if you read foreign policy journals or whatever, it's just that's what these people, that the people that really shape or craft our foreign policy, they're imbued with these ideas. They were educated in them. They really absorbed them, and they still are in charge. Maybe again, like on the margins, occasionally you get these, these realistic viewpoints expressed, but they just seem to be on the margins, and it's still there. And it's, again, I think like in the case of Russia, there was, as we know, there was this very firm belief that Russia was going to collapse, and before our economic and then military onslaughts, and it just didn't happen. And it's not something that we should have learned a lesson, but it seems like we haven't. It's just that faith in American exceptionalism is still there.
Can you help explain why the U.S. military is in a sorry state and is not capable of really engaging in a war, full-scale war with countries like Russia or China or even potentially Iran?
Well, I mean, it could. Again, the U.S. does have a lot of military assets. We do have a nuclear arsenal. We do have a rather a substantial missile force, so the world's largest air force. I believe that our Navy actually has been surpassed by China's. Again, the China's shipbuilding capacity is far outstripped. It's like 250 to 1. It's quite extraordinary. And the Russians have pretty much decided not to go down that path. And I think they may be wise. It's just that, again, as we've seen that with these new technologies. Part of it, of course, is, on paper, we're very impressive. If we were fighting a war 20 years ago, I think there's no question that we would come out on top in a lot of these places. But now there's at least there's a big question mark. At least, there's no doubt that we could do a lot of damage to other countries, but they can also damage us. And, when we're fighting the wars, as seems to always be the case, it's not like the Iranians or the Russians or the Chinese are building bases in Mexico or Canada or patrolling our coasts or anything like that. They're not seizing Caribbean islands. Of course, the Soviets kind of did that, and that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that's the last time that happened. It's the opposite case. We're on the other side of the world and projecting our power. There was a time when we're so powerful, like vis-a-vis China, that we could get away with that. But those times have changed. And if we just focused on defending our own borders or even our own hemisphere, I think there's no question that we can maintain a dominance for decades to come. If we just said, okay, it's like, the South China Sea, that's just really not our place. Obviously, it's called the South China Sea, but the Gulf of America, so-called, that's our, clearly it is. These are, they don't belong to us, but they're, they clearly are within our sphere of control, beyond the sphere of influence. And I don't think any foreign power has shown any desire to intervene there. The problem is that we go overseas, so we put ourselves at a disadvantage, right? And we fight wars of choice that we don't need to fight, and the countries there, whether it's Iran or Russia or China, say that you're right on our border, you're threatening us. For them, it is existential. And so there are all those things. There's the motivation, there's the long logistic lines, that put us at a disadvantage. But then there's also this revolution in technology. And, we've talked about that. For example, in the war in Russia, it's become clear that drones are a very, very important part of contemporary warfare, that they really have revolutionized warfare in ways that nobody understood until this war broke out. I think mentioned that 75% of Russian casualties now are caused by drones. On the other side, it's probably below 50%, Ukrainian. And that's not because the Russians have fewer drones. They have quite an advantage in drones, but they also have artillery. They also have an air force. And so they can actually kill Ukrainians in many different ways. But even so, it's like at least a third and maybe a half of Ukrainian casualties are caused by drones. So this is the new warfare, and we have not prepared for it. I've heard that just the other day, the Pentagon created an FPV, a drone unit. But just now I say, hey, maybe we should start preparing for this. But we're, way behind the curve on this. So you look at all those different factors, and I think, that, again, that military power that seems so impressive on paper is not nearly as impressive in reality.
Right. I mean, it's amazing when you say that 75% of the Russian casualties are now being caused by drones. It just shows you the tens of billions, hundreds of billions of armaments that we've sent into Ukraine. And at the end of the day, those aren't what's inflicting the damage upon the Russians. It's not even our stuff that is working. None of our stuff has really been that effective. So just our whole arsenal, everything on paper, that $1 trillion price tag for our military, it's not doing anything. And we don't have hypersonic missiles. We don't have great air defense. It's just like, I just, any way I look at it, I just feel like this is a joke. And we want to talk about, manufacturing capacity. Russia's out producing all of NATO. A factor of like 4-1 or something like this?
Yeah, according to Mark Rutte, the General Secretary of NATO.
So according to NATO itself, we're being outproduced by Russia alone. And then I think 90% of all drones in the world are built in China. And you just see how fast China can build things. It's insane. They have robots building robots over there. It's the idea. And we have a hauled out manufacturing base, and we're slapping on tariffs to try to stimulate some type of manufacturing, but we don't know how to build things in this country anymore. So just the whole thing is just absolutely ludicrous to me, that we still have this firm belief that that we are all powerful and all dominant when we can't beat the Houthis. We've lost every war of choice since World War II. And now we're like, okay, well, we failed in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we can't take out the Houthis. Maybe it's time to take on China. I think we can do this. Like, what is going on? And then something else that just doesn't make sense to me is, why do we have this obsession to have power projection? Why do we want to be in the South China Sea? Like, what is the point? It doesn't seem like Russia or China have any desire to be in the Gulf of America now or off the Atlantic. Like, this doesn't... What is our rationale? What's our reasoning? What's our raison d'etre for this,